All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about Nepal.
Nepal.
Specifically, we're going to be taking a look at this book, People of Nepal,
Yeah, People of Nepal. Fascinating book.
a fascinating look at Nepali society, kind of a snapshot in time.
It is.
I mean, when was this written?
So this was written after 1950,
Okay.
which, for context, that's when Nepal really began opening up to the outside world after a long period of being really quite isolated. So this book is really valuable.
Kind of a window into that world.
It is, for sure. It
Yeah.
offers like these firsthand observations of a culture that, until that point, not a lot of outsiders knew much about.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And for this deep dive, we're really going to focus on a particular chapter
Yes.
where Bista, the author, he goes deep on the Brahmins and Chhetris in Nepal,
Right.
and specifically those living in the middle hills and valley.
A heartland, yeah.
Yeah, kind of their historical center.
Exactly.
And we're looking at like the 50s and 60s,
Right, that's kind of the snapshot, the era that he's focusing on in this chapter.
and we're going to really get into like their social structure,
Yes.
their traditions, like all the key rituals around marriage and death.
It's all in there. Super interesting.
Really get into the nitty-gritty of their daily lives, straight from Bista's perspective.
Yeah, I think what's amazing is how detailed he gets. Like, you can really picture what their world was like back then.
So, yeah, let's jump into it.
All right, let's do it.
One thing that really jumps out just from the beginning is how much influence the Brahmins and Chetris had,
Oh, yeah. Huge.
like shaping Nepali society.
Absolutely. I mean, they weren't just a big part of the population. They were dominant.
Yeah.
In politics, social life, religion, you name it.
And it's historical too, right?
Totally. So Bista points out the Shah royal family.
Right.
They were the Kuri and Chhetri, these are castes, and they played a massive role in the Gurkha conquests.
Like going back to the 1700s.
Oh, right, starting in 1768. So right there, you see this deep connection between caste and power.
Yeah, and that connection, it doesn't just disappear.
No, not at all. Even during the Rana family's rule.
That's like mid-1800s to mid-1900s.
Exactly, 1847 to 1951. Now, the Ranas, they were the top dogs, no question. But when you look at who held those key positions, administrative roles, military,
It was a select group.
it was, and you see a lot of Chetris in there, along with some Brahmins and Newars.
So even when power shifted, it stayed within like certain circles.
Yeah, and Bista makes this very clear in his observations. And even after 1951, when the Shah dynasty came back into power,
Yeah.
you still see a lot of Chetris holding those high-ranking positions. It's a pattern that Bista picks up on, and it speaks volumes about their influence.
And you can't talk about this without mentioning the caste system.
No, it's woven into the fabric of Nepali society.
And Brahmins, they're at the top.
They are. Highest rank in the traditional Hindu caste hierarchy.
And they were, generally speaking, they were wealthier.
Yeah, both Brahmins and Chetris compared to a lot of other groups.
Their languages, Nepali and Sanskrit.
Yeah, that's another marker of their influence. And of course, Nepali went on to become the national language.
So you can see how all of this, it gives them a lot of sway over like culture and identity.
For sure. It's like they set the standard in a lot of ways. And it's interesting geographically where they were concentrated.
Yeah, more than half lived in the Western Hills.
Right, that's where they were the majority. The Terai region down south, they weren't as densely populated there.
So this chapter also dives into their origins, like where did they come from?
Yeah, and there's this historical narrative that Bista brings up that Brahmins started arriving in Nepal from India,
Around the 12th century.
or maybe even earlier, potentially driven by Muslim invasions seeking refuge. They first settled in these hilly regions, Kaman, Garhwal, now part of India, and the western districts of Nepal.
So it was this gradual migration, not like one mass movement.
Right, more of a trickling in over time, finding places to settle in these new lands.
And he talks about these casas too, right?
Yeah, the Khazas. They were already there in western Nepal, shepherds, and this chapter kind of identifies them as having Aryan stock.
A complex term for sure.
It is, but in this context, it's pointing to connections with Indo-European migrations.
And they eventually spread into the hills of Nepal as well.
They did, and what's fascinating is their language, the Khaz language, had links to Sanskrit.
Showing those ties to the Brahmins who came later.
Exactly, and then you have this intermingling intermarriage.
So it's not just one group replacing another, it's much more fluid.
Yeah, Bista talks about local women being integrated into Brahmin and Chhetri communities. And this might have led to certain groups, local groups, being elevated to Kshatriya status, becoming Chetris.
Okay, so let's get a sense of what their daily lives were like.
Yeah, so Bista paints this picture of their homes in the Middle Hills. Imagine small, two-story structures made of stone or mud brick with these thatched roofs,
Very traditional.
very much so, and they'd be scattered across the landscape.
Not like packed into cities
No, more on hill slopes, hilltops, valleys, along ridges, and they'd often have whitewashed exteriors.
or painted with red ochre.
Right, and inside they were usually washed with cow dung.
Interesting. So like materials and techniques that were readily available to them.
Exactly. It reflects that connection to the land and also the practicality. And they made a living mainly through farming and government service.
Okay.
Men also traditionally joined the military, so you see that connection there. Land ownership was common, but often on a modest scale.
Makes sense. And within the Brahmins, there were different subgroups.
Yeah, Bista talks about the Kuman Brahmins, and there were two main types, Purbya and Kumain.
Purbya being eastern, Kumain being western.
Right. And the Kumain, they came from districts west of Uttar Pradesh in India, and they migrated to Nepal at different times than the Purbya. And Bista kind of hints at these potential differences in social standing between them, based on their migration history and ideas of purity. Like, did certain groups consider themselves more pure Brahmins based on when and where they arrived?
So even within a caste, there are these nuances, these hierarchies.
Totally.
And Bisa also mentions these irregular unions.
Yeah, so this is where things get complicated. He
Hmm.
talks about Brahmin men having children with women from other castes.
And those children were called Jaisi.
Right, and they faced this social stigma, couldn't really be priests because it kind of messed with the whole caste purity aspect of that role. However, there's an interesting exception. Bista notes that marriages between Brahmin men and Thakuri women, those were accepted within the Thakuri caste, so it shows you that there was some flexibility depending on the specific castes involved.
Like these rules, they weren't always hard and fast.
Exactly, but overall, intercaste marriage or even just romantic relationships, those were a big no-no.
Yeah, Bista really emphasizes the stigma around that.
Huge social pressure to keep those boundaries in place.
And he mentions the Gotras, too.
Yes, the clan names for Brahmins and Chetris. So you've got these markers of lineage, shared ancestry, that kind of solidified their identity within these groups.
Okay, and then there's this concept of sannyasis.
Right, so these were people who renounced worldly life.
Brahmins and Kshetras both could do this.
Yeah, and Bisa suggests a few reasons why they might do it. Domestic troubles, genuine spiritual calling, who knows?
So a mix of motivations.
It seems so, but what's interesting is they could come back to family life.
Like it wasn't a one-way ticket out.
No, and importantly, when they came back, they still kept their caste status, so it was seen as temporary, but still a pretty significant choice.
It's like stepping outside the system, but not entirely breaking free.
Exactly.
And Bista touches on the Nuer community as well.
He does. It's brief, but he points out that there were occupational castes among the Newers that kind of mirrored the Brahmins and Kshetris in terms of their roles, but the specific hierarchies and interactions, those would have been different.
Like different rules within a different cultural context.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about marriage.
A big one, yeah.
Bista says monogamy was the norm for Brahmins and Kshetras.
Right. One husband, one wife.
But polygyny did happen.
It did, but it was less common. You'd see it more with wealthier folks, the Ranas being a prime example. Polyandry, on the other hand.
That's where a woman has multiple husbands.
Exactly. That was basically non-existent in these communities, according to Bista.
Interesting. And he also noticed some interethnic marriages.
Yeah, where Brahmin or Chetri men would take wives from other ethnic groups. So again, you see this interaction, but within certain power dynamics.
And choosing a spouse, that was a big deal, right?
Huge. Like, not just about romance, but about maintaining that social order.
And cross-cousin marriage was preferred.
Yeah. Specifically, paternal cross-cousin marriage, your father's brother's daughter.
Keep it in the family, so to speak.
In a way, yeah. And for Thakuris, marrying your maternal cross-cousin was also acceptable. But there were rules.
Like, couldn't marry certain relatives.
Right. Couldn't marry your father's sister's daughter, your sister, or your daughter's daughter.
Yeah.
All about keeping those lineage lines clear.
Yeah, and girls got married young.
Yeah, early teens, often after menarche. Boys, usually after their studies were done.
And there was this older tradition of marrying girls around 6 years old.
That Bista mentions, yeah. It was considered really auspicious, brought a lot of punya, religious merit, but by the time he was writing, it was probably less common.
And I imagine virginity was a big deal.
Huge. Bista emphasizes how important it was for Brahmin girls and the shame associated with any premarital activity. It was all about family honor, tied to a woman's purity.
And arranging marriages, that was the father's job.
It was. The girls, they didn't have a whole lot to say. But Bista does note that in more modern settings, like cities, things were starting to change.
Like education and social standing could give a girl more options.
Right. And practically speaking, they'd use a middleman, a lami,
Okay.
to kind of scope out potential partners, see if the families were compatible, and astrology, that was crucial.
Most stars had to align.
Literally. They'd consult an astrologer to pick the most auspicious date and time for the wedding based on the lunar calendar. Certain months, like Baisakh Jest and Mangsir, were considered especially good.
And going against tradition, not really a thing.
Bista points out that unorthodox marriages were pretty rare. It was all about sticking to those customs.
Okay, so let's talk about the wedding ceremony itself.
Okay, so picture this. The groom's family and friends, they all set out in this procession, a jaunty.
Yeah.
And the size of the jaunty, that reflected how important the family was, socially and financially. Often there'd be musical bands making it this big celebration, very much so. And before the main ceremony, they'd have a ritual called Swayamvara, where the bride and groom would exchange garlands and gold rings, signifying their commitment.
Like a pre-wedding engagement,
Yeah, exactly. And then the main event,
which could last a while.
oh yeah, 24 hours or more, starting in the late afternoon.
Wow.
And one of the key rituals is Kanyadan.
Giving away the bride.
Right, where the bride's parents, they formally present her to the groom. It's this symbolic moment where they're entrusting their daughter to him. And before that, they often do gordua.
Foot washing.
Yeah, the bride's parents wash her feet as this gesture of respect and blessing.
Lots of symbolism there.
Tons. And after Kanyadan, the groom gives the bride new clothes and jewelry.
A makeover.
Sort of, yeah. And she goes to an inner room to change, and it's like marking this transition to married life. And while she's doing that, in the courtyard, there are Brahmin priests performing rituals,
Okay.
sacrificial fires, offerings to different deities, the whole 9 yards. And then the moment that seals the deal.
Sindoor Haline.
Yeah, the groom puts vermilion powder on the bride's hair parting. That's it. She's officially married. And it's usually this joyful moment with everyone feasting and celebrating.
So marriage is not just a ceremony, it's this whole complex thing.
It is deeply ingrained in social, economic, religious life. And once they're married, family is everything.
Yeah.
Divorce was frowned upon, though it was legally possible.
And having a son, that was crucial.
Super important. He'd carry the family name, ensure their well-being, perform those essential death rituals for his parents.
And for new bride, it wasn't always easy.
No, it could be tough. She had to work hard, earn the respect of her in-laws.
And Bista mentions that in some Chhetri communities, wives were expected to do a lot of the heavy lifting, literally.
Yeah, especially in places like Dodi and Dadaldura in the West. And in some lower status Chhetri groups, there might have been a bride price involved. And from a young age, girls, they were taught how to run a household, preparing them for this life.
Religion was central, too.
Totally. Brahmins and Chetris, they were devout Hindus, worshipping Shiva, Vishnu, Rama, Krishna, all the major deities. And they had a ton of festivals.
Like Dashain.
Right, with the goddess Durga, animal sacrifices, feasts, the Tika blessings, and then Tihar, the Festival of Lights.
Associated with Lakshmi and Yama.
Exactly. And the Brahmins, as priests, they were the ones leading all the ceremonies, reciting the Vedic texts.
Okay, last but not least, death rituals.
So when someone died, they were usually cremated near a river.
Okay.
And they would often save a small piece of bone to later immerse in a holy river, like the Ganges, if they could afford it.
Okay.
Close relatives would mourn for 13 days.
And during that time.
They'd avoid certain foods, certain activities. The chief mourner, usually the eldest son, he'd shave his head, wear white.
Signifying grief.
Yeah, and throughout the mourning period, they'd make offerings to the deceased. Food, water. And then the final ceremony, Kriya, conducted by a Brahmin priest, usually with a big feast. Occupational castes, they might help with the preparations, but not the main priestly duties.
Yeah, those roles were strictly defined.
Right. And Bista mentions other important rituals, too.
Like after a baby's born.
Yeah, they'd observe post-birth pollution for the mother and newborn. And then the naming ceremony, Noran, and the first rice-feeding ceremony, Pasni.
Important milestones.
Definitely. And for boys, they'd have the Chudakarma, or Shiar, where they'd shave their head around 5 to 7 years old. It was a big religious thing.
Okay.
And then Brahmin boys would also have the Bradabanda, the sacred thread ceremony, marking their coming of age, usually between 7 and 15, though Bista notes that this custom was declining for modern educated girls in urban areas.
Okay, so to sum it all up,
Yeah.
this chapter of People of Nepal, it gives us this incredible glimpse into the lives of Brahmins and Chetris in the middle hills and valleys.
It's like a time capsule.
Yeah, their customs, their traditions, their beliefs, it's all laid out in fascinating detail.
Absolutely. It's this rich tapestry of social and religious life, all filtered through Bista's observations. But remember, this is a snapshot of a particular moment in time.
And the Nepal has changed a lot since the 50s and 60s.
For sure, and that's something to think about as you reflect on this chapter.
Yeah, like how have things evolved?
Right. How has modernization, increased connectivity, how have those things impacted the traditions and social structures that Bista describes? What do you think has remained the same, and what has undergone a complete transformation?
So much to ponder.
Tons.
All right, that's all for today's deep dive.
Join us next time.
Thanks for listening.
See you then.